The School of Statesmanship at Ascension University presents Framing 2020, a casually crowdsourced briefing on the state of the art and our hope for the future.
The Canary in the crypto mine. Civilization never recedes. The law of necessity ever forces it onwards. Jules Verne. Higher and higher, having learned to play with fire, we go higher and higher and higher. The Moody Blues. Early civilization was bounded by certain cornerstones. These included the taming of fire, the domestication of animals, private property, and slavery. On November 9, 1967, the fire spewing from a 363-foot-tall Saturn V rocket developed 7.5 million pounds of thrust. An organ grinder's monkey had been trained to pick an unlimited number of pockets. The dream of home ownership still excited the average American, and the middle-class factory worker was beginning to feel more and more like a wage slave with no way out. Still, the power of the muscle car, the excitement of a horse race, and the crowning achievement of establishing a home made the double-double toil and trouble of the daily grind seem worth the effort for most of us. Only when we are faced with the non sequitur, the inequity, the folly of those who take the gift of liberty to illogical extremes while taking license, does our righteous indignation become aroused. We've tolerated the robber barons because they got stuff built. We've made allowances for the discontented whose first impulse in the face of any disagreement is to wage war. We've made the best of things we can't control because, at the end of the day, we've usually found ways to pound swords into plowshares, or, in the context of our times, convert bombers into passenger planes. When Malcolm Stamper was asked to spearhead production of the Boeing 747, that company had bet its future on the success of a project that involved monumental engineering and logistical challenges that would include not only the usual design, fabrication, and marketing pursuits, but also the coordination of widely dispersed teams consisting of over 50,000 individuals. The task included building a new factory that would span the equivalent of 40 football fields, thereby making it the world's largest. Stamper recalls a speech given by Juan Trippe, the visionary founder of Pan American World Airways.
When Juan Trippe came to Seattle to sign the contract, it happened to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Boeing Company, and he was the guest speaker at a large banquet downtown. And so he gave this speech on the 747. And he was a very idealistic man anyway. He'd started more or less international travel by, spawning Pan Am from the days when there were prop airplanes flying and so forth. And he said, I think that the 747 is a great weapon for peace, and it's really competing with the intercontinental missiles for man's destiny, which sort of surprised us all. And he thought it was going to win. And he explained that when you got millions of tourists flying back and forth between countries and they were exchanging their goods and produce and products and so forth, that you'd learn to like each other before and do business with each other before you'd blow them up, I suppose. And turns out that he's pretty close to right, because 20 years later we're bringing out a new airplane, the 747-400 version, and that year Reagan and Gorbachev have decided to scrap missiles. And so, and we're doing it's a trillion revenue passenger miles will be flown in 1989. So Juan Trippe was really a prophet.
Civilization's cornerstones have been upgraded in certain parts of the world where the most exciting fire is largely confined to within the capsule of a diode. Animals have sometimes proved to be our most loyal friends, and we've become accustomed to property that is held personally as well as part of the Commonwealth. Now, the civilized way of captivating a free people is through affinity marketing. Oh, that reminds me, be sure to hit the subscribe button, and while you're at it, please rate this program wherever you get your podcasts. Entrepreneurial spirit has steadily moved civilized society up the value chain. Competition is seen as a stimulating challenge by the most creative among us. Capitalism is both rewarding and frustrating even when the playing field is level. When it is tilted, Markets operate in an environment where the fix is in, while a great humanity pays the price for the lack of any competition that is truly real. Our checkered past has produced some outstanding visionaries, together with people that are thoroughly jazzed by simply working the plan. Our politicians are a mixed bag that includes not only the most disputatious and self-serving, but also some aspiring to true statesmanship. While there may be a fragment of truth emanating from the bumper sticker that reads, "It's all good," the more powerful, most enduring truth is conveyed through the oft-truncated biblical statement that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. This episode and the ones that follow explore some dead ends in the hope that we can avoid the otherwise inevitable consequence of not learning from history. We have before us lots of choices about just how we are to advance. Instead of standing on the shoulders of greatness while biting it on the back of the neck, humanity can choose to be informed by the experience of our forebears, to appreciate, to work in a collaborative way, and to ring in a brighter future. The next time you look into the eyes of a child, think about what you can do to combat the most parasitic forms of tyranny while also building for that child a world of nurturing infrastructure and a culture of benevolence. Most of this country's citizens will tell you, "I'm proud to be an American." And indeed, we've come a long way, baby. Class warfare. Few things are brought to a successful issue by impetuous desire, but most by calm and prudent forethought. Thucydides, 400 BC. True liberty is predicated on the reality of authentic intelligence, genuine fairness, supreme justice, and social equity. False liberty is simply not. We've all encountered misleading packaging within the open arenas of commerce. This treatment describes some of the ways a philosophical framework can also be, and often has been, designed to mislead. Statesmanship has long been eclipsed by hyper-partisan behaviors driven by moneyed interests. These exert wildly disproportionate political pressures, effectively subjugating the will of the electorate to that of the most self-serving. Instead of working, in accordance with the first constitutional imperatives, to build a more perfect union, many politicians promote division by derision. The people that enter public service with the best of intentions often become contortionists in matters of character. Between January 16 and 18 of 2019, Axios and SurveyMonkey polled 2,277 people on the question of economic reform. 70% of respondents said they would be excited to vote for a 2020 presidential candidate who promises to reform the economic system. Even a quick tour of a country's hybridized economy, such as ours, cannot take place in isomorphism. It is conditioned by world events, and our intent is to be respectful of that context. We are also laboring to be informed in a dispassionate way by the planet's contemporary use cases for emotionally charged terms, such as capitalism and socialism. Language evolves. Although we should be informed by history and thus grounded, we need not be limited going forward either by tradition or to a term's etymologies. We hope Framing 2020 will help to bring what should be the most coherent value proposition for any candidate into sharp focus. Whether you're black or white, male or female, gay or straight, rich or poor, non-believer or believer, young or not so young, you likely care about equal access and opportunity, and you have a right to be treated with the utmost respect. The central issues addressed here not only affect us all, they have serious consequences for our offspring. To the extent it highlights the common good, everyone could potentially benefit from prayerful consideration of the patterns revealed through this exposé. If you see the ongoing class warfare as having been thrust upon us, if you view the idealized economy as a hybrid, if you are tired of worn-out talking points and having the candidates talk down to us or deceive us, then you will likely agree with the thrust of this particular project. you will have made a good start in helping to break the stranglehold the most self-serving have over our country. One of the biggest concerns, shared by many, has been the way our elected representatives often frame any given controversy in ways that don't really serve the common good or are carefully designed to mislead. It is also disconcerting that the media seldom challenges such a framework. For example, we've been told, for decades, that healthcare decisions should be made by you and your doctor, not some government bureaucrat. The current problem is, decisions that may serve your best interests are far more likely to be vetoed by your insurance company, due primarily to that company's financial interests and cost concerns. Let's be clear. We're not arguing that a company should not have cost concerns. An individual company and its investors do represent the kind of special interest that should serve to inform our decisions within a free enterprise economy. No one wants their paycheck to bounce. And clearly, an industry segment represents an even greater interest, one that may be fully justified as significantly more influence is brought to bear. However, in the greater context, no matter how compelling, these relatively narrow interests should be far less of a factor than they have been traditionally. Our elected representatives are, after all, supposed to be championing the highest and best interests of a much larger constituency. They should be focused on the way we each experience the economy, not just a select few. Narrow shareholder interests are often different from the national interest. To deny the kind of mental health services that could potentially reduce unemployment, homelessness, the number of no-call, no-show attendance problems among employees, and the creation of public charges is a penny-wise, pound-foolish example of public policy. Proper health policies have the potential to bolster the gross domestic product, the GDP, and even reduce the kind of frustration levels that sometimes result in domestic violence and mass shootings. The only ones that benefit from an engagement that leads to enragement, and the current patchwork of health insurance coverage, are those who habitually capitalize on human misery. While it is surprising that there should be so much disagreement on the fundamentals, the fact is we've been snookered by integrity-challenged politicians and business people for a very long time. Issues that support the political modus operandi of divide, rule, exploit are placed front and center to distract us as the true condition of our nation is deliberately obscured. On June 1st in 1950, a little-known freshman senator from Maine took to the Senate floor and exhibited the kind of courage that has rarely been seen before or since. Margaret Chase Smith challenged the pack mentality of that day as she took on the virus spread by Senator Joe McCarthy. In an era when freshman senators were to be seen and not heard, Smith later recalled, "This great psychological fear spread to the Senate, where a considerable amount of mental paralysis and muteness set in for fear of offending McCarthy." Constrained by Senate decorum, Smith focused upon the tactics of McCarthyism as she asked her fellow senators not to ride to political victory on the four horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. The Hartford Courant later commented, "This cool breeze of honesty from Maine can blow the whole miasma out of a nation's soul." Today, the acronym FIBS refers to the same fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear that are part of every dirty trickster's political toolkit. Few remember the statesmanship-like qualities of the freshman senator from Maine, as we witness the tactics she exposed playing out every day as though nothing has been learned by the electorate. We cannot trust the elected representatives that habitually sees any constituency as their annuity. It is the responsibility of our electorate to take our country back, to create conditions favorable for the emergence, or in a few cases the re-emergence, of true statesmanship. As we examine certain constitutional imperatives in light of the ideals of true statesmanship, we perceive a stark contrast against the expediency of partisan politics. In so doing, it is hoped we will advance the demand for a science, a philosophy, and a religion that are commensurate with the evolving spiritual, intellectual, and societal development of a great humanity. What was once a casual interest in our participatory democracy has now been largely displaced by a new fervency that is no longer tolerant of BS artistry. Now, when we raise the issue of democratic principles, and where the habitual response is that the United States has a representative government, our newly conditioned political reflex demands an answer to the question, representative of what exactly? Similarly, when someone advances the notion of conservatism or progressivism, we should be asking, conserving what? Or progressing towards what? Experience may, in fact, be the best teacher, although we should not be too didactic about just how any new social contract is to be formed. Our more perfect union must allow for the awesome agility that can only be obtained by leveraging our diversity. Our call to unity is not going to be successful through an obsessive insistence on uniformity. A templated malady. What passes for capitalism in the United States is often a systematic privatization of gains together with the socialization of expenses and losses. Upon close examination, it reveals the extent to which many who tout the undeniable virtues of a free marketplace are, at times, engaging in anti-competitive practices and perpetrating a fraud upon the public. Some of them are habitually sticking others with the bill for their commercial activities. An examination such as ours can also reveal how companies, to their own detriment, squander goodwill. They draw down equity to meet the expectations of a fickle group of investors that are not informed by, and largely indifferent to, what is needed to maintain the enduring health of an enterprise and its host country. This persistent erosion is today manifest as decreasing the value of, impairing the competitiveness of, and increasing the debt of the United States, its companies, and its citizens. The overall health of a nation is indissolubly linked to the health of its citizens and its enterprises. The latest recession officially ended in June of 2009. A recovery and expansion has continued uninterrupted for over 10.5 years as of the publication date of this program in January of 2020. The oligarchy is actively engaged in sabotaging many of the reforms that were instrumental for restoring confidence in the U.S. economy after the deregulation folly tanked it. The current efforts to kneecap the Consumer Financial Protections Bureau is just one example of how it seems as though nothing has been learned since the days of the Great Swindle. On December 30th, 2019, the New York Times described how the United States Treasury Department, under the cover of darkness and through a largely opaque rulemaking process, exempted certain companies from new regulations. What was sold as a long overdue effort to fight corporate tax avoidance has, in fact, enabled such avoidance through a combination of sloppy work on the part of the legislature, intense lobbying by multinational corporations, obvious conflicts of interest on the part of regulators, and the arbitrariness of Treasury's rulemaking. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, ranked the United States as 33rd out of 36 OECD countries with market economies, as its tax-to-GDP ratio dropped 2.5 percentage points between 2017 and 2018. Of course, the debt increased during the same time, effectively shifting the cost of executives living high on the hog to future generations. The high GDP combined with a low tax burden also made companies operating in the United States uniquely situated to pay a living wage and to make other contributions to the overall health of our nation while remaining competitive. In yet another reminder of how any multinational can quickly pull up stakes, several companies that were born here have threatened to relocate their headquarters operations to other countries if their taxes were to increase. People in the know are not going to mourn the loss of these self-serving companies, Nor would they hesitate to impose punitive tax rates when these same companies try to peddle their schlock within the United States. Attentive citizens have begun to realize that what certain con artists champion is not in fact true capitalism, but a highly corrupt and counterproductive variation that some of our neighbors have long recognized as combining the worst aspects of capitalism and socialism. They've appropriately labeled this modality as skirt capitalism. The fact that these countries are often seen by us as practicing democratic socialism demands a common set of definitions as well as an exhaustive examination that will contrast and compares these two expressions. Because they may represent the will of the electorate here and elsewhere, achieving a common understanding would be beneficial. As with any parable, or parabolic analogy, there is always a directing arc and a focus. In this case, our directing arc is 22,000 miles above us in what is known as the Clark Belt. Among other things, it hosts an array of communications and observational satellites. It is from such commanding heights that our view has been conditioned by the powers that be, and not by the essentials as highlighted in the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to our Constitution. In the way this story unfolds, we hope to retake those commanding heights while gaining a new strategic overview and thus bringing our most challenging problems into sharp focus and striking relief. This narrative will take the reader around the world, with the United States as both the point of departure and also our primary focus. It is hoped that together we can blow through the circumscribed worldview that only serves those intent on contracting the arc while promoting authoritarianism. There are forces in this world and in the United States that have always favored the kind of self-aggrandizement that would prove useful while enslaving the masses. Here and now, they would distract us from the most important First Amendment issue of our time. The attacks on net neutrality, together with their clear democracy implications, have not been properly reported by an excessively compromised, distracted, and lemming-like media. Any honest examination of what cable company owns your favorite news channel clearly reveals why. It's not just the dollar skew or the profit-motivated that distort our reality. By 2008, it was slowly revealed that our global financial system was on the verge of collapse. And while the causes are directly traceable to self-dealing bankers and self-serving politicians, even the non-profit Associated Press had become complicit in the smokescreen by encapsulating the event as the Great Recession in their manual of style. While many go-along-to-get-along journalists debate the merits of whether Great Recession should be spelled with an upper versus lowercase g and r, Lisbeth Kirk, editor-in-chief of the EU Observer, clearly saw through the smoke to the more important issue when she wrote, "Let the historians, not the sub-editors, categorize major historical turning points." Because partisanization has crashed through all the traditional guardrails and infected every aspect of American life, creating a political environment hospitable to the emergence of true statesmanship is a daunting challenge. Even though it is eventually and likely to be achieved politically, it will require focus, persistence, and true political transparency, as opposed to the opaque political machinations we only think we see. If politics finally gives way to statesmanship, it won't happen overnight. For as one longtime senator observed, if you have politics in your bloodstream, only embalming fluid will replace it. Framing a new vision for our future will be an ongoing effort. If we hope to avoid becoming just another failed state, the demands of a vibrantly alive, participatory democracy will certainly include a push for the electorate to be all in. After all, when all is said and done, decisions are made by those that show up. Evolution unerringly achieves its end. Therefore, it can be reasonably foreseen that there will be no end to the evolution of political sovereignty, short of the appearance of a government for all of humankind. All other sovereignties will someday be seen as transitory, relative, intermediate, and even subordinate. Our people, and those throughout the rest of the world, are looking for authenticity. When we are no longer leading by example, we are not leading from behind or anywhere else. We must work together to ensure the rising tide that lifts all boats will serve as a prelude to a future of light and life, not one of continued inattention that is marred by failed destiny and cataclysmic climate change. As we put forth clarifying questions and statements that may be used for equipping the citizenry, we may thereby focus our elected representatives on the common good. Our vision for 2020 and beyond must be a serviceable one that can help each of us to blow past a deliberately circumscribed and media-conditioned worldview. In 2008, as they were denying, enabling, and ignoring malfeasance at home, many American politicians also shifted focus. Some indulged in jokes about Iceland, even as the likelihood of a global financial meltdown was rapidly becoming clear. These quips included: question, what's the capital of Iceland? Answer, about $3.50. Question, how do you successfully freeze your financial assets? Answer, invest in an Icelandic bank. What was actually happening in Iceland was no joke. Those of us who remained teachable learned valuable lessons from an often ignored country that, rather than acting on impulse and catering to incoherent reasoning and circular logic, addressed their own unique set of economic challenges in a methodical, highly disciplined way. At the root of the Icelandic term, Capitalism, is pisfaldur, which refers to the hemline of a skirt. This particular form of capitalism is bold, until things go wrong. Then it runs to hide behind mommy's skirt. It privatizes gains, while socializing expenses and losses. It is, arguably, advancing the worst of both capitalism and socialism. Our friends in Iceland have clearly identified and articulated the kind of integrity deficits and business practices that have plagued their country as well as ours. The image of an impetuous child hiding behind his mother's skirt after having done something wrong was seared into the public consciousness of Icelanders. This was due to the great swindle that came to light in 2008, only to be followed by an eclipse whereby what was termed the Great Recession obscured the central truth of the matter. Politicians and complicit media insist, to this day, upon glossing over the so-called financial crisis, when in actuality it was a huge theft that became possible in large part due to the sleight of hand, the lack of transparency, and the obfuscation that were a central feature of the derivatives market and highly leveraged banks around the globe. It bears repeating. As we debated capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other, as we oversimplified the equation, we inherited the worst of both worlds. Leveraged to the hilt. When you combine ignorance and leverage, you get some pretty interesting results. Warren Buffett. In 2001, banks in Iceland were deregulated. As was the practice with many banks around the world, the offloading or uploading of debt occurred as expansion ensued. The Icelandic banks were extensively leveraged. They were not alone, as they found it increasingly difficult or impossible to refinance their loans in the interbank market. Creditors were insisting on payment, while other banks were simply spooked, unwilling to make new loans. In 2008, banks in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom had a run on deposits. All three of Iceland's major privately owned commercial banks were experiencing difficulty in financing their short-term debt. They defaulted. Unique to Iceland was an unfortunate circumstance. Their banks were so much larger than the national economy that the Central Bank of Iceland and the Icelandic government could not guarantee the payment of the bank's debts. Relative to the size of its economy, by the end of the second quarter of 2008, Iceland's external debt was more than 7 times the gross domestic product of the country in 2007. At the same time, the assets of the 3 banks totaled more than 11 times the national GDP. Accordingly, the Central Bank of Iceland found itself unable to act as a lender of last resort during the crisis. On October 6, 2008, the Icelandic legislature authorized the Financial Supervisory Authority to take control over the country's financial institutions, and domestic deposits in the banks became priority claims. In addition to the preferential treatment of certain large depositors, in the event that the bank had to be liquidated, retail deposits in Icelandic branches of Icelandic banks were guaranteed in full. Too big to fail or jail? Not. An arrogant person considers himself perfect. This is the chief harm of arrogance. It interferes with a person's main task in life, becoming a better person. Leo Tolstoy. On the evening of October 7, one of the governors of the Central Bank of Iceland, David Oddsson, was interviewed on RUV, the Icelandic public service broadcaster. In that interview, he stated that we do not intend to pay the debts of the banks that have been a little heedless. In the days that followed, agreement was reached between the Icelandic and other governments on the savings of their own citizens. The Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Finland, Norway, and other countries all negotiated on behalf of their citizens. Some of these negotiations were highly contentious, as threats of freezing the assets held in the branch offices of Icelandic banks were commonplace. On February 27, 2009, the Wall Street Journal reported that Iceland's new government was trying to raise $25 million by selling its ambassadorial residences in Washington, New York, London, and Oslo. The top managers of all 3 Icelandic banks which collapsed during the financial crisis were criminally charged. 13 of the court cases ended with guilty verdicts, 4 with not guilty verdicts. Questionable financial practices included the following. Almost half of all the loans made by Icelandic banks were to holdings companies, many of which are connected with those same Icelandic banks. Money was allegedly lent by the banks to their employees and associates, so they could buy shares in those same banks, while using the same shares as collateral for the loans. Borrowers were then allowed to defer paying interest on the loan until the end of the period, when the whole amount plus interest accrued was due. These same loans were then allegedly written off days before the banks collapsed. Capithung allowed a Qatari investor to purchase 5% of its shares. It was later revealed that the Qatari investor bought the stake using a loan from Capithung itself and a holding company associated with one of its employees. In other words, the bank was in effect buying its own shares. Iceland's business leaders, that had previously been considered financial gurus and credited with growing Iceland's economy, came under intense public scrutiny for their roles in causing the financial crisis. Former Prime Minister David Oddsson has also stated that Iceland needs to investigate unusual and unconventional loans given by the banks to senior politicians during the years before the crisis. Over 1 decade later, the investigations are still ongoing. The steady decay of economic foundations throughout the world led to a crisis of confidence in centralized banking, fiat currencies, and public policies perceived as rather arbitrary. The coupling of currencies, such as that of China's yuan to the American dollar and later to a basket of currencies, has been just one factor resulting in large systemic trade imbalances. The ownership cram-downs that occurred just as taxpayers picked up the cost for corporate incompetence in the United States prompted investors to shop the world for alternative investments. The advent of open ledgers, consensus mechanisms, and assurances of immutability became the guiding light at the end of the tunnel. Although cryptocurrencies are still perceived as risky, fiat currencies are no longer regarded as safe. And in the mind of the materialist, nothing else matters. The best things in life are free, but you can keep them for the birds and bees. Now give me money. That's what I want. That's what I want. The Beatles.
You have been listening to one of 8 audio presentations in a series titled Framing 2020. I'm Bob Kalk. Thanks for listening. Please visit www.framing2020.com to subscribe to this and other related podcasts. There you will find the transcripts and links to other educational materials.